Hi.
Hello. I'm just going to turn your, if you could turn on mute and turn your camera off. I'm gonna do a little introduction and then I'll bring you in.
Hi.
Hello. I'm just going to turn your, if you could turn on mute and turn your camera off. I'm gonna do a little introduction and then I'll bring you in. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this evening. My name is Lisa. I'm the Archive Projects Manager at the Museum of Youth Culture. And today is one of three online talks that we're doing that's delving into some of the amazing research and collecting that was done as part of our most recent project called Amplified Voices, turning up the volume on regional youth culture histories. And that project was funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. So a massive thank you to lottery players. And a lot of the project was looking at particularly stories in the Midlands and in the North. But we also had a subsection of the project that looked specifically at the impact of online culture on young people and teenagers, and how young people have used digital media and online spaces and platforms, and how they've really become integrated in the experiences of young people and teenagers. Now, to give you a little introduction to the Museum of Youth Culture, we are an emerging museum that's all about celebrating the scenes, styles, and social movements forged by young people in Britain. Our aim is really to build this collection that has 100 years of youth culture from the 1920s to the present day, and that really works to preserve, showcase, and tell the histories of teenage lives. It's a history that's at risk of being lost. There's no museum that's solely dedicated to the lives of young people and teenagers. And we think that by creating a space that really celebrates and delves into these histories, we can make sure that the story of young people and teenagers is preserved for future generations. Now, Amplified Voices had this digital element into it because we realized, looking at our collections, that we have amazing histories of past youth culture movements, and we also have amazing histories about young people and teenagers today, but we really struggle to showcase and exhibit stories of digital culture and online cultures, and of course that plays such a huge role in young people's lives today. Now, one kind of, I guess, way in which this gap is demonstrated quite strongly is that archivally we actually have a bit of a I guess, historical gap in our collections around the early and mid 2000s. And part of the reason, we really see that is because you have this amazing digital and social revolution going on. You have young people taking on and using new social media platforms to connect with people around the world. You have young people that are using the earliest smartphone technology, taking the first selfies, creating the first online communities, and that was super powerful in connecting people. But technology has changed so much in the last 15 years, and so many of the technologies that young people were using in the early 2000s are now obsolete. So actually, when we approach people to ask for photos of their teenage selves in the early and mid 2000s, quite often we're hit by a bit of a gap. People that used MySpace, but because MySpace did this big transfer recently and lost all of their data pre-2010, there's that huge gap missing there. Or people who were using kind of early smartphone technology and those phones broke, they never backed up those images, or simply the cameras that they were using were such early rudimentary versions of digital cameras that the quality of the files is so incredibly low that you actually can't get much information out of that. And that technological gap from an archival point of view has posed us with a bit of a risk. I think the other side of the difficulty in collecting and telling youth culture histories is that as social media has become so embedded, as online technology has become so embedded, there's actually such a wealth of stories and histories out there, things that people can really delve into. The ways in which people showcase and share photographs, videos, and other aspects of their lives on online technology is actually so vast. It begs the question, well, how do you start curating that as an archive? How do you start collecting these stories? So there's kind of a two-way dilemma there that we face as an archive. And it's one that we have always known in the back of our minds and have thought about, but we haven't really addressed fully. And this project was one of the first times that we actually invited academics and researchers in to help us address some of these issues and actually start having some of these discussions and having some of these conversations around these areas. You know, this is incredibly important because young people have been so at the forefront of the evolution of online culture and online technologies. And for young people today, it's a really important part of how they communicate, how they express themselves, but also how contemporary youth and subcultures emerge. So as a museum that celebrates youth culture and young people's innovation, we really need to make sure that we are telling, celebrating and showcasing these histories. And so that's really where this current project was all about. So what we'll be doing today is I'm going to chat about two bits of academic research that we commissioned as part of the project, which is really around delving into, I guess, the evolution of online culture in young people. So I'll be introducing those two papers. I'll be talking a bit about who wrote them and what they delve into. I will later post links as well in the chat so that if you want to read those papers on our website, you can. And after that, we'll be chatting to two of our outreach champions. Firstly, Emily Everett, who's been delving into, I guess, early online subcultures. And she was busy collecting stories from people that were there, that were forming part of these communities. So she'll be talking about the stories that she collected. And after that, we'll be chatting to Dan Glass, who's been collecting stories of LGBTQ plus culture. So yeah, the first aspect of this project was really us bringing in experts in the field to kind of say, well, actually, we need to have that historical context of how these social media platforms emerged, but also how young people use these platforms at this point in time. Now, the first piece of research that was commissioned as part of the project was by Sean Lincoln, and it was really an exploration of how social media acts as an extension of the teenage bedroom. Now, Sean Lincoln is an independent scholar who has published widely in journals and anthologies on aspects of youth culture. Her monograph, Youth Culture in Private Space, was published in 2012, and her book, co-written with Bradley Roberts, Growing Up on Facebook, was published in 2020. She is the co-editor of two book series, Cinema and Youth Cultures, and Palgrave Studies in History of Subcultures and Popular Music. Now, we first actually met over our love of teenage bedrooms. For those of you that have visited the Museum of Youth Culture, you will have seen our teenage bedroom installation. I personally think they're some of my favorite photos and stories, and they really enable you to kind of track changes in culture and I guess societal change and the youth experience through photographs of teenage bedrooms. And Sean has done a lot of research around teenage bedrooms. I was really excited to find out about her book, Growing Up on Facebook, and the scroll bag methods that she learned about. And this is really one of the interesting ways in which people are trying to collect and tell the history and the impacts of social media on young people and young lives. Now, for Growing Up on Facebook, they basically did these long form oral histories called the scroll bag method, where they sat down with the participant and they would literally scroll back through their entire Facebook profile. Now, for the book, they specifically looked at people who were in their mid-20s that went on Facebook in the infancy of Facebook as teenagers. So you can really trace their evolution over a decade and their experiences of growing up over a decade. And so they would sit back and scroll back through their entire Facebook profile. And in that, you see some of the history and the experiences of those young people and kind of, I guess, the changes they've been through, from old friends to big life moments. But it also showcases the changes in how a platform like Facebook is used and also how it's slowly fallen out of fashion with young people and isn't amongst the more popular, I guess, sections of social media. So we had some interesting conversations around how social media in some ways are these kind of extensions of the teenage bedroom in how we express ourselves, how we experiment, how we share our passions. So we commissioned her to do some research that looks at the rise of social media and young people using social media, but also to look at that in the context of the teenage bedroom as well. Now, the final piece of research was entitled Bedrooms, Youth and Digital Cultures, the Shifting Boundaries of Teenage Space. And it traces youth self-expression from the teenage bedroom through early gaming and internet culture to contemporary social media platforms like TikTok. And kind of looking as well at the impact that the pandemic had on this evolution. Now, introducing the research, she says, as an academic, I have spent a number of years exploring what bedrooms mean to young people. At university in the early 1990s, I took a module on youth cultures in which it was clear that the dominant history of youth was told through the activities young people do in public spaces, out in the streets, in school, youth clubs, bars, pubs, clubs, places in which young people were visible. But I wondered what happened at home before entering the public domain. How do youth cultures play out in private spaces? What were the rituals of, say, a young punk getting ready to go out? And where did those rituals take place? Likely in their bedrooms. What did their parents say as they emerged from their rooms into the living room, provocatively dressed and styled, ready for a night out? How do young people manage those private and public boundaries as they move through them from one space to another, from bedroom to living room, to a bus or train, to a pub or club? How are their teenage identities compromised, challenged, or affirmed? The experiences of youth culture and the boundaries of youth cultural spaces are fluid, porous, and liminal. And as we examine what youth culture is today, this has never been more the case. She really starts at the teenage bedroom and kind of these really personal experiences we have as young people and how we explore spaces and how we learn about spaces and how we find, I guess, our passions. And I think what makes being a teenager so exciting is discovering new things and sharing those with friends and family, and communicating that with the rest of the world. And she really looks at how online platforms and technologies helped young people kind of expand those four walls of the bedroom and connect with wider audiences. Now, as she states later on, a space beyond the four walls now existed. Scholars such as Sonia Livingston, OBE, have described how bedrooms from the 1990s onwards were becoming more media-rich spaces. By this point, it was common for children to have a stereo in their rooms to play music, while increasingly televisions would also be found in bedrooms, when previously they would have most likely been only in a living room for shared family viewing. Now, game consoles were becoming more popular too. Young people increasingly had leisure at their fingertips and they didn't even need to leave the home. And I think this is quite interesting because you can really see how bedrooms become different spaces and they become less just about you and yourself and you and your mates, maybe what you put on the walls, but also new technologies that come in, you know, even down to playing music, where that was something that a lot of young people didn't have an accessibility to unless in a shared space, you know, having to go out and find a jukebox that played the right music or going to a club to listen to the right records, you know, to the evolution of where we are now, where you've got music in your pocket and you can listen to it personally in kind of your own space. Now, Sean really traces how online social media networks kind of evolved. And I think the thing that I found quite interesting reading her research back is actually how the majority of big social media platforms emerged in such a short timescale. Now, the first social network site, 6 Degrees, was actually founded in 1997. And if you think about the decade that followed, you know, initially you had the online messaging tools like AOL, Yahoo, and MSN Messenger. You know, then you start moving into online forums and blogging, you know, places like LiveJournal. But then you start getting the more, I guess, traditional online social media profiles like Habbo, Friendsetter, MySpace, Facebook, Bebo, YouTube, Twitter, Tumblr, and Instagram. And those all emerged in a 10-year period. And now so many of those social media platforms are really kind of embedded in our day-to-day life. It's quite interesting how actually so much of that happened in such a short scale of time, and very, very much a lot of the time, young people were at the forefront of that change. They were the first people picking up those platforms and using those platforms in some way. I was a teenager in the mid noughties. So for me, Facebook was kind of the social media platform. You know, I've written a piece on the website as well about how, you know, living in a rural village, for me, MySpace was a way to showcase the music I was into and to connect with people across the world. And, you know, for me, being part of that platform was really, really groundbreaking. You know, talking about MySpace, Sean really says this was quite a groundbreaking platform, and it's really the first platform where you see on a big scale the way that people use social media today. Now she says the boundaries between public and private spaces were beginning to shrink. Not only could MySpace users connect with friends and their peers, they could also make global connections, building up a truly international friends list. In addition, MySpace users could connect in more immediate, real ways with their favorite musicians and bands. No longer did they have to rely solely on magazines or television to find out about them. They could connect with them quickly and regularly just by checking out their page. The immediacy of these interactions made the distance between star and fan feel much less, and the personal connection much more intense. I think in that way, MySpace was quite interesting as well, because it was a way to extend your bedroom. You know, one great thing about MySpace that I still miss to this day is that you were able to actually customize your page completely. So you were able to put different backdrops on. You were able to put animations on. You could write a little introduction. You had a little media player on there, so you could stream your favorite song. So, you know, in some ways, it was similar to someone walking into my room. They could see instantly what it was about, what my interests are. And I think MySpace was the first one where you really see that evolution to, again, what social media profiles are like today, how we kind of share what we are up to, our music, our passions, where we're going out. And in that way, it's really quite a dynamic form of the teenage bedroom, and that it allows us to share our tastes in our spaces. I think the article does a really interesting job in terms of tracing that really nice connection between the teenage bedroom and social media. And I think, you know, there are, of course, downsides to social media platforms and how they're used. But also there's actually something really important about social media platforms in a way that it's enabled us to connect. You know, in many ways, these platforms are a connection of what was already happening in terms of how people connected. You know, people were connecting with people via little ads in NME and Melody Maker, and making friends and kind of finding pen pals and meeting up with those friends to go out, because maybe in the town where they lived, there was no one else that loved, you know, the band that they were listening to. And social media platforms has made that global, but also much easier accessible. And I think while there are the downsides to social media platforms, there's actually real benefit there as well in terms of how we connect and how culture can spread. That's really, really exciting. And I think the analogy of exploring social media platforms through the teenage bedroom allows you to really reflect on that. Now, the second piece of writing was really looking a bit more at online communities that we form. So less about the actual platforms themselves and how they're used, but actually the communities that we create online and how we connect with people. Now, this second piece of research commissioned for the project was done by Janessa Williams, and it was around online fandom cultures and communities. Now, Janessa Williams is a freelance music journalist and media academic based in Leeds. She has recently submitted her PhD thesis, which explores the Me Too movement in relation to music fandom, asking questions about how modern audiences navigate cancel culture, online community discussion, and moral listening habits. Her work has been published by the likes of NME, The Guardian, Rolling Stone, DIY, The 45, and more. Now, the piece is entitled Tracing Music Fandom Practice Through the Internet, and explores how online platforms have created new ways for people to build community through the lens of music fandoms. Now, I think this ability to create online communities is an incredibly important part of digital platforms and young people. The way it enables us to connect, but But I think for us as a museum and an archive that looks at the history and the expression of young people, it's also quite interesting because it looks less at the individual, but more actually at these communities that we form, these bonds that we form as teenagers that are so important to us later in life. And so it was really interesting to get Janessa to look at online communities, but through the prism of online fandoms. Now, introducing the research, she says, as a music journalist and media academic, there are endless ways in which online fan culture enabled me to get into the position I'm in today, studying new forms of digital interaction, belonging, and audience empowerment. From LiveWire to LiveJournal, street teams to Stan armies, there has been no shortage of pioneering activities in the last 3 decades that have changed the way we think about music consumption and in turn youth culture. Music fans, of course, come in all ages, genders, races, and cultural demographics, but there can be no denying that, in the words of the esteemed fan studies scholar Christian Lee Harrington and Denise Bilvey, fandom in youth and adolescence has received considerable attention over the years from industries and scholars alike, reflecting both the profit potential of the youth market and the long-held association between fan practices and childhood development. Now, she divides her research up into 4 sections, or 4 decades, so to speak. The 1990s, which is all about fan forums and mailing lists. So really those kind of early online cultures where, people are interacting with each other and communicating with each other and sharing a connection, but they're not yet really creating that kind of online bedroom, so to speak. And people are finding connections through these talking and messaging forums where they can reach out to other people. Then she goes on to the 2000s, which is really all about torrenting, MySpace, and music blogging. And so that's where you really see the kind of more, I guess, personalized and individualized approach to social media, where people are putting out their own stories and their own histories. I love that she's included torrenting because it was such a big thing for me as a teenager, and I think it was such a little short moment, but it is really the creation of mixtapes, essentially, but in a digital format. In the 2010s, she looks at stans and professionalized fangirls. So really how you get this kind of increased interaction between the fan and the musician and kind of getting, I guess, a much more personal approach and where people are really reaching out to the artists. And she brings it all the way up to the present. In the 2020s, she looks at AI remixes, onstage interactions, and the continued rise of the music influencer. Now she really makes makes the link between in real life youth culture communities and their extension on online spaces. She says, before the internet, a fanish sense of connection normally relied on knowing other enthusiasts in your local proximity, attending physical meetups and concerts, or joining mail order fan clubs and zine distributions, waiting eagerly to get and receive an update on your favorite artist in the post. When the World Wide Web launched in the early 90s, fans, women fans in particular, were amongst the first to use it to facilitate conversation of fandom. And I think it's really interesting that, when young people were using online social media for the first time, a lot of it was in the context of fandoms and of connecting and creating these online communities. And, I think online fandom-based subcultures are a really fascinating area that we definitely need to do more research into and find more stories around. Now, she talks about the revolutionary way that online culture enabled fans from across the world to connect around artists and create these kind of international fandoms. And the fact that these online spaces, as social media evolved and grew, really created this two-way connection as well. So it's not just fans being able to follow and connect with the artists that they follow, but also artists connecting more directly with their fans, sharing some of their stories, sharing some of their experiences, even down to, I guess, Instagram stories, short TikToks. You really feel like you get an insight into the life of the artists that you follow and the music that you listen to. Now, she also talks about how these platforms in turn also enabled artists to launch their careers and really kind of build up this online fan base, connect with people digitally, and then kind of, I guess, radiate out from the digital and kind of make it into the music industry that way. So, from the Arctic Monkeys who used MySpace to Pink Panthers who used TikTok. Now, she quotes scholar Nancy Byam, Finally, the internet can eliminate the layers of filters that separated fans from performers in years past. People who might never get backstage can now expect at least some bit of seemingly interpersonal interaction with the artists that they adore. And I think, again, it's quite interesting around how we connect with the artists that we love. Now, she traces it all the way back to contemporary fan culture. She says the past 3 decades have shown just how readily fans have learned to communicate through forums and social media. But in the age of AI, gender fluidity, and the infinite possibilities of online remix culture, it no longer seems enough for fans to observe or even talk about music online. Many fans now want to directly insert themselves into the action. Sometimes this results in fun creativity like TikTok duels and viral choreographies, while other times it seems fans directly overstepping their boundaries and going to extreme lengths to interact with artists in the hope of securing viral content. So again, it's really interesting, I guess, approach and evolution into how we create these online spaces, how young people use these online spaces, and how they have evolved over time. Now, these 2 pieces of research are on our website if you want to read the full essay. And I will again make a link within the comments of this YouTube so you can look back to them. We're now going to swap over to the second part of this online talk, where we'll be chatting to 2 of our outreach champions who've delved into online cultures. Now, for those who aren't aware of it, the Online Outreach Champion Program is a program that we launched back in 2020 in the midst of a lockdown. Now, the year before, in 2019, we launched Growing Up in Britain, which is our public submissions campaign, inviting everyone to submit and become part of the Museum of Youth Culture. Now, we really launched that campaign because we truly believe that everyone has an important story to tell about growing up and being young. And the nice thing about youth culture and building a Museum of Youth Culture is that's really something that everyone can be involved with. So in 2019, we started inviting people to submit their photographs and stories, and it's kind of evolved from there to include oral histories, objects, ephemera, and really grown the collection in many different ways. Now, the way that Growing Up in Britain was originally run was just an online campaign via social media, supported with some public scanning socials and events. But we realized that, with that, you're never going to cover everything. We really want to make sure that when the museum opens, it has the widest and most diverse range of stories possible. So in 2020, we launched the Outreach Champion Program, which is essentially a micro-grant program. And as part of that program, we work with individuals, community groups, and youth groups to collect stories for the museum that they feel are important or that they feel are missing from our collections. And it's helping us to reach much wider audiences and make sure that, maybe people that we don't reach via social media, we reach in different ways. And so we're currently on the second round of our Outreach Champion Program. In this round, we had 6 regional stories, which we'll be hearing more about tomorrow. The areas that we were targeting were Glasgow, Newcastle, Carlisle, Bolton, Coventry, and Birmingham. Alongside that, we did a round of 4 outreach champions that were specifically looking at online cultures and starting to think about, well, how can we collect and tell online histories or the importance of, digital communities. So Emily Everett, she was one of the first outreach champions we had on the digital side. She's here with us this evening. I'm just going to introduce Emily, and then she's going to share a bit about the project, and we're going to have a bit of a discussion about that. So Emily is a UCL history graduate based in London. Her research dissertation, inspired by her own experiences as a self-harm campaigner, focused on media and cultural narratives around self-harm. She's currently engaged in further research surrounding activist narratives of self-harm in the 1990s in Britain. In her spare time, Emily works to support events in the rollerblading community, focusing on increasing the engagement and participation of women and queer athletes, as well as attending plenty of gigs. Now, I'm going to just read to you the introduction to her collection. As someone who grew up during the golden age of the internet, I have retained an ongoing fascination with it as a means of communication in youth subcultures. My own experiences using MySpace in the mid-2000s, long before the ubiquity of app-based social media, created a long-standing fascination with how people have utilized the internet as a way to communicate and organize around their interests. In particular, memories of news articles in 2006 and 2007 detailing the emo death cult, where teenagers apparently swapped advice on how to self-harm, left a lasting mark of just how enormous the gulf between the actual experience of being young online and the mainstream representation really was. In addition, my work as a self-harm campaigner, as well as my academic research on representations of self-harming in the media, covering everything from Princess Diana to the aforementioned news articles, led me to feel a deep frustration with the lack of channels in which to tell subcultural and personal stories, and to explore the genuine positive elements of digital spaces and cultures. As any millennial will know, our digital experiences are nuanced and deep, and our online and offline lives intertwine in a myriad of ways. In this project, I wanted to explore present an array of diverse narratives on online and offline spaces in subcultures, showing the variety of digital experiences all the way from LAN parties to the 1970s punk Facebook boom of the early 2010s, to the big on MySpace scenesters and the niche interest forums stalwarts. While we still retain a variety online, our engagement with digital spaces and subcultures has changed significantly over the last 3 decades with the rise of apps. Stories about how we use and have used the internet are a crucial part of subculture history from the 1990s onwards, and it was an utter joy to be able to witness and collect these stories. So yeah, Emily, if you want to turn your video back on and unmute yourself. Hello, how are you doing?
Hi, yeah, I'm good, thanks. It's great to be here. Yeah, thanks for the introduction. I think that was pretty much sums it up.
But yeah, thank you so much for joining. I mean, is there anything, I guess, do you want to talk a little through a bit further about, I guess, the project, but particularly who you were reaching out to and some of the people that you interviewed for this?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, kind of, I started thinking a lot about online subculture when I was doing my research on like self-harm in the media, because there's a whole unavoidable part of that, which is this kind of link that was created in the media at that time about kind of the connections between subculture and self-harm, which wasn't actually necessarily new in the 2000s, but it was kind of it did kind of really blow up, and it's still like a massive thing that gets wheeled out today, kind of as a big concern about, you know, is behavior contagious online and that sort of thing. So that kind of started me thinking about it, because obviously I remember being a teenager in the early 2000s and kind of really using the internet a lot, and how these positive experiences of like community building and communication between young people can be so positive and such an amazing thing that are just kind of left to the wayside in favor of more kind of sensationalist and scary narratives. So yeah, as a sort of terminally online teenager and having lots of friends who were also very online, I had like a pretty amazingly big pool of people to talk to through a kind of variety of different things. So the people I spoke to, I mean, yeah, it was quite a wide variety. I think, how many interviews did I do exactly? I can't even recall now, but they were all quite different, and there was sort of a range of different ages as well. So I started with talking to someone I know called Cass, who was very much involved in the My Chemical Romance fandom, and she was sort of an organizer. She organized a lot of events on Facebook, and she modded a fan page on Facebook that had quite a lot of followers, or friends might have been called at that time. You know, the terminology changes on Facebook, but she had great photos, and it really illustrated this kind of move from the kind of earlier 2000s social media like MySpace, LiveJournal, Vampire Freaks, onto where everything was on Facebook in the late early 2000s, so sort of 2010, 2009, 2010, 2011. So that was really interesting. And then they had a lot of meetups, so it was sort of this really interesting link between the online and the offline and how they sort of work together and were in both kind of important spaces in this one community. That was the first interview I did. I also spoke to my friend Ash, who is a car modification enthusiast. So he again he was obsessed with cars before he could even drive. He was always sort of posting and looking on kind of these early forums, probably early 2000s, maybe even late 90s, kind of, yeah, just talking about car modification and learning more about cars and things like that. And eventually got his driving license, I think lost it almost immediately, and then started his own kind of meetup group called WLC, which then spiraled into this huge thing. Lots and lots of really big car meetups in West London that ran for a couple of years, I think. Yeah, again, late 2000s. So another really good representation of the online and offline worlds kind of meeting, and how these kind of connections that he'd developed from quite a young age, just simply from going online, trying to find places to learn about something that he was interested in, and then meeting people through it and carrying these connections from these forums in the early 2000s into these car meetups in the late 2000s. So yeah, really interesting. And then there's all kinds of things like that around the kind of law in public spaces about cars and noise and young men being in one place at one time. And yeah, really, really interesting. Another really different story that I looked at was a friend of mine called Will, who lived in rural Somerset and moved there in the late 90s and became part of a kind of community club that was started by him and his friend, running LAN parties in a barn, in the upstairs of a barn. And that became like a huge kind of esports community in rural Somerset in the early 2000s, when, you know, at that time, not everyone had their own computer at home. And they had to, you know, you had to go somewhere to use a computer, either at school or to a friend's house, maybe, or to the library. So that was really interesting, especially with the rural consideration of kind of, you know, it being harder to meet people outside of your village. And, you know, if you were the one guy in the village who was a computer nerd, you know, and you didn't have a computer or you didn't have any friends to play games with, you know, where did you go? Because back then it wasn't, you know, internet connection wasn't what it is now. So all these sort of technological considerations around, how do I game online with my friends? Like, how do I do this when I don't have internet at home, or, you know, I don't have the latest Counter-Strike, or, you know, anything like that. So that was super interesting. I also talked to a friend of mine called Kerry, who was a Kings Road punk in the 70s. So she did not grow up online. She grew up very much as a street punk on the Kings Road. But she was a very early adopter of technology, the internet, connecting with people online. She had a MySpace account. Would have been in her late 30s, I guess, at that time. And she was also very much a part of the kind of squatting community, and like living off grid communities, protest communities, that kind of thing. So she's like done all this amazing stuff. And I talked to her about how she kind of experienced like joining websites like MySpace and Facebook, and especially Facebook in sort of 2007, 2008. There was this huge boom of kind of older punks reconnecting with friends on Facebook. And you know, she was saying she'd sort of connect with people that she hadn't seen for 30 years, and she didn't know, you know, back then you didn't keep contact with people. People didn't have necessarily even a phone number if they lived in squats and stuff like that. So there's people that she didn't know, you know, she didn't know if they were alive or dead, and she hadn't spoken to for 30 years, and they reconnected on Facebook. And it was this very short-lived kind of burst of lots of images being reshared of their youth and kind of reconnecting over their youth and their subculture interests on using Facebook. So I was really interested to talk to her about that, because it's a totally different perspective of a subculture that didn't originate online, like maybe a lot of the subcultures that I was interested in as a teen. You know, my interest was very much funneled through the online kind of space because that was the first access I had to them. For her, it wasn't that. It was, you know, a street-based subculture that then moved online. And it was, yeah, really, really, really interesting to talk to her about that. I feel like I'm talking too much, by the way, so if I need to stop, just please pause me. And yeah, the other two interviews I did an interview with a chap named Terry Leith, who was part of the sort of alternative music and hardcore communities, as well as being a graffiti writer. So that was really interesting because, again, there's a big kind of legal consideration there of it's a very, very anonymous community, and especially it was in the kind of early-ish days of the internet in the early 2000s as well. So, for instance, when I asked him, you know, do you have any images? He was like, no, absolutely not. Like, no, nothing. You know, they were not like selfie happy emos or anything like that. So that was really interesting. And also looking at the link between the hardcore music scene and the graffiti writing scene, which are quite separate, but there is, with any subcultures, there's always overlap, which is, even if they're like completely separate, there's always something connecting them. So that was really interesting, sort of, yeah, thinking about growing up in inner city London and having this very offline hobby, you know, graffiti writing. You know, you go to physical places, you write graffiti on the walls, but the sort of photo sharing and sort of codes of conduct that came up around that was sort of, and how they were communicated. So that was absolutely fascinating. And then finally, I spoke to a friend of mine who grew up, Jamie, who grew up in Plymouth, like rural kind of villagey Plymouth, sort of area around Plymouth, sorry. And he's been involved in organising events in the rollerblading community for a really long time. And we organised events together now. So it was sort of really interesting to hear all the stuff from him that I'd never heard about organising events in the 90s. Him kind of being a very early adopter of forums, which were super janky, and you checked once a week because that's when you got access to the internet. And kind of also a lot about the kind of smack talking elements of online culture, which was quite a big thing in rollerblading and still is quite a big thing in rollerblading. So that was also very interesting as a point in time where, you know, obviously forums have always been moderated, but those, the kind of ideals around how you moderated forums were quite different than to maybe now, where we're, you know, if we use Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, you know, you're bound to their kind of terms of service, whereas these individual subcultural forums were probably moderated by your friend who was just like, yeah, it's fine, you know. Yeah, we don't like that guy either, we're going to ban him, like, you know, it was quite different. So that was really interesting as well. And how those forums, even though, you know, you weren't attached to them all the time, how crucial they were in spreading information about events across the country, and how these networks of people kind of cropped up. And obviously now, you know, Instagram and Facebook are, well, not Facebook so much anymore, but Instagram is still used a lot as kind of a crucial thing for skate events. But, you know, it wasn't always like that. And it was very interesting getting that perspective and hearing about how things were kind of as the tools that we use to communicate on the internet changed over time. So that was like a big focus for me in all of my interviews, was thinking about how oh my god, I forgot Kai as well. Sorry, I need to talk about Kai as well because she was absolutely fascinating. Kai was really into alternative music. She was the other person I interviewed, and she now lives in Sweden, but growing up, she grew up in central London, in Islington, with her mum, and got really into punk music, queercore music, hardcore music, the kind of straight edge scene, but as well as being kind of very on MySpace. And she, yeah, gave me an amazing interview about kind of how she met people in the scene, in person and online, and how it evolved and how she finds music, and how the way that she used to find music in the earlier days of the internet has influenced now how she does find music. So she doesn't just go onto Spotify and type in, hardcore punk. It's all very much kind of looking at specific labels and kind of gigs that she sees in person. So that was really, really interesting. We had a good connection talking about Subverse, which was an underage club day at the Underworld in Camden Town. It was every fourth Sunday, I think. And all kinds of shows there. There was like emo bands, hardcore bands, new rave, that sort of stuff. And we both used to go there, so we had a great connection, talking about how ridiculous that was and how much fun it was. And what a great space for young people to connect with music, just absolutely amazing. There was a great combination of like these cool flyers that you would get when you went to the shows, or you would see handed out around Camden, then the online kind of MySpace side of it. Yeah, so interesting. So that's what we chatted about. I think that's everyone. I'm just going to double check that I haven't forgot anyone, because that would be completely unforgivable. Yeah, no, that was everyone. And yeah, so when I was thinking about questions, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I mean, yeah, that's basically it. I think I said, I was really interested in thinking about how the internet changed over time, because most of the people I know are still involved in a subculture in one way or another. So I was really interested to know from their perspective how things have changed. So that was kind of a big focus for me.
I think that's an interesting point, because I think we think of digital cultures or digital communities as very much these online spaces, but actually they're completely tied to the physical spaces, whether that's going to gig or just in IRL meetups. There's a real transience between the two, and it sounds like a lot of the people you spoke to touched on that.
Yeah, it was a repeated thing that came up, was the two things they're not really separate. At least in the interviews that I did, there was always an IRL component and an online component which mixed and matched together, and kind of exploring the ways that it did that is really interesting, because people have all kinds of different experiences in subcultural spaces, online or offline. So yeah, that was definitely a repeated kind of motif, was looking at that relationship between the two spaces, and the fact that the online space is different, also there's different qualities to communication, online, offline spaces, online, offline, but they're inextricable. They're together. It would be like trying to write a history of punk and goth subculture in the 80s without thinking about flyers and badges and band t-shirts and and venues and things like that. It's just an extension of the space. I think very, very connected. Yeah.
I think the interesting thing about it as well, I mean, Cass mentioned the MC Army, and I remember being a teenager, and from what I remember, that was kind of like the first big moral panic around young people and the internet. And I think it's quite interesting how there has always been, in terms of the media and how it's talked about by wider society, this kind of undercurrent in terms of moral panic about how we talk about social media and social platforms that doesn't necessarily highlight also the benefits of finding this community. Could you talk a bit more maybe about how Cass, spoke about that, or the MC Army more generally for people that don't know, but also just anyone else that mentioned that?
Yeah, so yeah, she talked about kind of feelings of isolation that she had growing up, living in, I think, Watford, which is not a dead zone, but it's not the most interesting place, and feeling kind of, especially with her interests being into certain bands or looking a certain way, how that led to kind of this feeling of exclusion at school, and how finding this kind of this fandom where everyone cared about the same things that she cared about and were willing to do it as a group gave them this kind of strength in numbers that she just had not had before, which was, it's really touching. It's not just, oh, I went on Facebook. This is like an important thing, and she talks about a lot of other people, feeling the same way, and connecting not only through the music that they liked, but how they felt kind of in their larger communities, like school mostly. As a teenager, obviously that's a huge part of your day to day. So yeah, that was really interesting, and kind of she talked as well about kind of, there was a certain place, I think Jubilee Gardens, I think it's called, in London, which I think is near the South Bank, where they used to have their MCR meetups, and how there was often kind of issues with police or other members of the public kind of feeling concerned about these groups of young people being all in the same space. And there wasn't necessarily anything illicit happening, like drinking or drug use, to a huge extent, but still there was this like moral concern about these young people who dress a certain way, kind of being all together in a public space. And that's kind of, I mean, the moral panic thing, it's an interesting one. I've thought about it a lot, obviously, in relation to the kind of self-harm thing, because that was what I looked at in my previous research. And there's always been this worry about contagion. If you see someone, or if you are aware of a subculture, or you're aware of this music, this horrible music, that will then create problems, as opposed to possibly considering the idea that perhaps it's a solution to a problem rather than a cause of more problems. That never seems to be a consideration. So whereas Kaz, the way she spoke about it, was definitely talking about it as such a positive thing that's created these long-lasting connections with people that she's still friends with, and taught her a lot about how to use, kind of how to manage like a large following, and marketing skills, basically. If you want to be crude, it's their skills to have, which is not something that you would necessarily expect to see in the paper, I guess.
Did any of the people that you speak to reflect negatively on the online space?
Not that I can particularly pick out. No, I think actually it was all quite positive. I think there was mentions of, when you're managing a big following in a group, that can become overwhelming because it can spiral out of control quite quickly, and you've got hundreds of people coming to a certain place, which you're sort of like, well, okay, it was 20 people last week. So that there was sort of a mention of that becoming a bit overwhelming for like multiple people, but not, I don't remember anything specifically negative being pointed out by anyone. I mean, I think more than one person mentioned sort of online arguments, but none that were really terrible. More sort of like, I'm sure I remember Terry talking about this kind of ongoing discussion about the code about posting photos of graffiti writing, and whose graffiti writing you would post, and how to participate in the culture and that sort of thing. But I mean, that's any community, isn't it? It's discussion of what the particular rules of that community are. But no, there was nothing. I mean, surprisingly, no, there was only positive recollections, and this is all people discussing. Apart from Kerry, everyone was discussing their youth. I think Kerry had a different view in that she felt in protest spaces that there's some because of the bombardment of information that we get, people tend to get a bit kind of overwhelmed because there's so much, whereas in the days of offline organizing it was a bit more straightforward. And she definitely felt negatively, not about necessarily MySpace, but more like instant messaging apps, I guess, now, and the constant supply of information. She definitely discussed her thoughts on that. But in terms of people thinking specifically about their youth and the way things were then, and maybe there's like a nostalgic rose-tinted element to that, but it was, there was some really, really touching stories, really, really touching, like amazing stories of connection and community. Just, it's great to listen to.
I think that's the interesting thing that's so powerful as well, is like that, those first, I guess you've been one of the early digital subcultures and early online communities, and I think they have led the way in terms of how powerful these digital spaces and communities can be, in terms of like connecting, and especially when you have people that maybe live somewhere where there isn't much else going on, or they can't find people that have the same interests, so they haven't got those connections there. They're actually such a powerful way to connect with people and find online communities, and I think that gets missed out in the dialogue around social media and online spaces a lot of the time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think because a lot of these spaces that I was discussing with people were kind of like, not completely, but mostly kind of young person led. They weren't being organized and put there. It was things that they were developing themselves, they were getting into themselves, which is really important. It's, when you're young, you don't have a huge amount of agency over your life, getting into something that's just for you and meeting people through it can be such a amazing positive, kind of like an amazingly positive impact on your life. Not to say there's not other considerations too, of course there is, but it's not, I think it's often missed out, that kind of thinking about these sort of connections that came from those spaces. I mean, it's hard now, I'm desperate to reflect on then and now and what it's like for young people now, and if how they organize now, because it's so different to when I was a teenager, which I like to think wasn't that long ago, but unfortunately it was quite a while ago now. So kind of think, I'm fascinated by the difference of how it is now, how people organize now, because even the way that Google operates is completely different now to how it was 15 years ago, when you could type something in and the results would be not necessarily sponsored results or the results with the most hits on the page, but would be the most accurate thing. So if you were like, I want to find a forum about modifying muscle car engines, it would throw up, muscle car engine forum, like moderation guides. You'd be like, cool. Whereas now it might throw up 20 pages of SEO content about what is a muscle car, and AI written kind of hit articles that have the most traffic. So even the way that the internet, one of the basic tools of the internet, functions is completely different. So it's just but I have no doubt that it's still happening. So I'd love to reflect on that, but unfortunately,
quite interesting, because I don't know if you've noticed this, but I've definitely felt this, that it feels like some elements of that like early noughties like forum blog culture have come back in some ways, and even with Substack becoming so popular and newsletters, and it feels like some of those, like I guess like earlier incarnations of online media culture, maybe even pre-social media, where people either creating forums or creating these newsletters as a way to communicate and connect, which is really interesting to see how that evolves.
Yeah, I'd love a return of individual forums. It's great. I mean, I was really into the Buffy the Vampire Slayer fandom quite young, And one of the kind of main forums, which I cannot remember for the life of me what the website actually is, but it's still going. So all the posts are still there. You can find posts from like 1998, people like mashing the keyboard, being like, "Oh my god, I got a giant spike cut out!" Like, but they can't post a photo because they didn't have a digital camera. Digital cameras didn't exist then in any way that was affordable for normal people. So it's like, and then people be like, "Oh my god, I'm waiting for like Angel Lover to come back online. She hasn't been online for like 2 weeks." It's like, they're all still there to look at, which is just incredible. And I'm like, oh, I crave this time of the internet. There's a level of kind of, of interaction that you get on forums that I think, maybe is partly covered by things like group chats, but anyone can join a forum. Not anyone can join a closed group chat. So it's that sort of open, interest-based element that fascinates me. I would love it to come back. Yeah.
I think that's fascinating that whole platform is still there.
Yeah.
Old comments. That's a whole archive project in its own right.
I have thought about it so much. Because I'm like, who's hosting this? Like, who's paying? Someone's paying for that. And that person has basically, it's a perfect screenshot. Even the formatting is still the same as it was 20 years ago. Like, it's a rare find, but it's still there. And it's still active as well. People still post on there, still active. So, it's still out there, but it's just finding it, It's like you have to know about it to find it.
That's fascinating. Yeah, as you say, like someone's still paying for the hosting. And I think that's the issue with, and the thing that we're facing in this museum and an archive of like, how do you archive this online content, is that actually so many of those forums, either technology is obsolete or people just stop paying for the hosting, which is also fair enough.
Yeah.
Started in the 90s. But actually that means that whole piece of history is lost. Even with like the MySpace transfer, like,
oh my gosh,
all the of MySpace were lost in that transfer.
Yeah, I feel like my inner historian cried that day. I did cry that day that the data was lost, because I remember when I was doing my research and I wanted so badly to write about MySpace, but it was so, how do you, if I was writing about it, I'd basically be saying, well, I was there and this is what happened. It's not really, I mean, that has a place obviously, but it's hard to kind of say that when you have no evidence to back up what you're saying. It's why oral history is so important and so crucial with this period of history, because it's, as you say, it's the obsolete technology thing. It's so hard. I had tons and tons of photos on my family PC, which are all gone now because that PC got a horrendous virus from me using LimeWire and deleted everything. It was gone forever. So all those photos are gone. All my photos from MySpace are gone. You don't think about the kind of, now even I would hardly think about the limits of how many photos you can upload, right? In 2005, I think you could have 8 photos or 6 photos on your MySpace. You could only have 6 at once. So you'd have to delete your photos and be like, oh no, this is the new me. This is the brand new me. So all those photos, gone. The comments, I remember my greatest achievement as a teenager was having a MySpace photo that had 70 comments on it, which, now is like 70 comments, that's nothing. There are people getting 200,000-300,000 likes on their posts. But back then I was like, I am famous now. Like, I got 70 comments, all gone. I can't remember what any of them said. Things like MySpace bulletins, that was a huge way of sharing information about parties, about meetups, about even I remember it being used to share information about predatory people, adults who would turn up to these meetups that were full of young teenagers, and people saying, watch out for this person. And they were shared on MySpace bulletins, which are, they're gone. It's all gone. So it's like, thinking of it in terms of an archive, it's like, what do we do? What do we do about that? It's like, you can talk about it, but I don't have any screenshots of any MySpace bulletins because at the time I was too busy being a teenager. It's fast. I mean, talking to Kaz, who was involved in the MCR fandom, she's like a natural archivist. She's saved everything. And I said to her, I was like, you actually have built your own incredibly huge archive of things. She had photos of everything saved, but she also came of age in a period of time where there was unlimited uploads to Facebook. And, she had a 1 gigabyte memory card for a digital camera. So there's a difference in technology there that is, impossible to ignore.
I know, and I think that's really interesting. I was super upset the day that all that MySpace data was lost, but it also brought into stark relief this thing of like, wait a minute, like I never even considered about the fact that it could get lost. But of course, that makes sense. And this was an accident. The MySpace transfer was an accident. But also it could be, these are private companies, or it's an individual that's hosting something. They might not have the money, or they might go bust. Things got lost that way. I had a similar thing. My computer broke when I was a teenager, like the family computer, again, viruses. What I hadn't realized is that they'd actually, I'd forgotten about this, but they'd actually managed to get some of the data off in, we took it to like a shop, and I got access to that, and I searched it, and I actually found one of my old MySpace templates.
No way.
Template.
Oh my God.
Extract the photo, but it also had my teenage introduction to myself. It had loads of, it was really basic, just HTML code, but it had those little tidbits that actually give you so much about how people were using social media at the time, what was popular, like even things like how we were, making emoticons using the keyboard versus emojis now, and that gets lost. And now it's still in living memory, and people reflect on MySpace, people write on MySpace, but actually, in 100 years, how can we reflect on what was a really important technology? And I guess in some ways you've got the issue of actually, like, some of these things might get lost, things break, technology changes. But then the flip side to that is that social media and digital online culture is so big now. Where do you even begin to archive it? How do you archive it? Like, it poses a big challenge, because the amount that people are posting, all these different communities that exist, there's so many. How do you start getting an essence of that?
Well, and this is when I was doing my research on self-harm, I realized that in, maybe 10 years or 20 years, when people become historians of this time period, as well as the kind of early 2000s, they're going to have to be data analysts. You're going to have to do data analysis. That's the only way you're going to be able to, I was thinking about this during COVID as well, when COVID kicked off and we moved from IRL to online overnight almost, almost all of our communication transferred online. And I was looking at Twitter, and I was like, scrolling it every day thinking, God, this is terrible. But it's fascinating as a historian thinking, like, we didn't have access to people's thoughts during the flu pandemic in 1918, sorry. We didn't have access to people's daily thoughts about what was going on. We just have photos of them and historical accounts, et cetera, a few journals and things like that. On Twitter, you have access to thousands and thousands and thousands of thoughts, fleeting thoughts just being put out there every day, as well as news. And I was looking at it all, and I was like, how would you even go about archiving this? How would you go about researching this? Because there's so much. You're going to have to be a data analyst if you want to be a historian of social. If you want to be a historian of social media, you're going to have to understand, metadata and AI and all that kind of stuff. It's but then part of me thought historians will probably still only want to read people's diaries, because looking at Twitter would just be too overwhelming. But it's it's a big consideration. How does that, outside of people personally archiving their own social media, how's that gonna look for historians of the pandemic, or historians of 2010 to 2020. You know, it's going to be challenging.
Interesting though, because there's that mix of things, isn't it? Because it isn't just like, you might archive the photo you post on Instagram, but as you said, on MySpace, you have those 70 comments on that photo, and that's part of that photo. Isn't just the photo itself; it's also the comments that go with it, and that kind of cultural context around it, the social context around it, and how we connect to people doing those things. And it's not just about, as an individual, I'll archive photos I post, but if I then look at those photos later, they'll be the individual photos. They won't reflect the context and around it, which is always, I guess, a difficult one. But yeah, I mean, I wanted to say thank you so much for joining us. Your collection is super interesting. Is there anything that you wanted to add as well, or anything that you thought of as you were doing this project or speaking to these people that you wanted to, I guess, mention?
I can't think of anything specifically. I mean, just that it was such an amazing thing to do. And I learned a lot of people that I spoke to were close friends of mine. Not everyone, but some of them were. And I learned so much about them and what they think about their experiences as a teenager. It was, you never sit down to talk about that really. It's maybe in passing and stuff, but especially when you meet people as adults and you weren't there with them growing up together, it's like a whole life that you don't know about. And it's really amazing talking to people about what they used to do or what they still do. So that was such a treat, and it was just an amazing thing to be able to do. It was so fascinating. And yeah, I hope that people enjoy listening to the interviews. I think they're super interesting. And yeah, that's it really.
Amazing. I mean, what I'll do as well is I'll put it in the comment section again tomorrow, so people can follow and find that online as well. But also, any way that people can follow you as well that you wanted to share?
Yeah, if you would like to follow me, you can find me on Instagram. My tag is at emilymay.e. I mostly post about rollerblade. So if you'd like to see that, but I do post about other things as well. And yeah, that's where you can find me if you want to find me. If you want to slag me off to my face, you can find me there.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Have a lovely
evening. Thanks, Lisa.
Bye. Amazing. All right. So now we're going to go to our second outreach champion this evening, which is Dan Glass. Dan Glass is an AIDS coalition to unleash power, or ACT UP, healthcare and human rights activist, performer, presenter, and writer. Dan has been recognized as Attitude Magazine's campaigning role models for LGBTQI youth, Guardian UK climate leader, a 2017 Activist of the Year with the Sexual Freedom Awards, and was announced a BBC Greater London Londoner in 2019 for founding Queer Tours of London, a Mince Through Time. Dan's new book, Queer Footprints, a guide to uncovering London's fierce history, uncovers the scandalous, hilarious, and empowering events of London's queer story. Now, from his introduction for his collection of stories that he collected, for Pride 2023, I am over the moon to have curated this special LGBTQIA+ collection for amplified voices, turning up the volume on regional youth culture for the brilliant Museum of Youth Culture. It's such an honor to share this collection of absolute legends across the UK who have brought so much queer love and power to everyone they meet with their art, activism, and movements for social justice. Here to reflect on their journey from queer youth to today, I hope it brings you all hope and joy in abundance. This year, 2023, is the 20th anniversary of the overturning of Section 28 that forbade the promotion of homosexuality in public institutions. The chants of never going underground and lesbians and gay men out and proud still speak volumes today. With the latest Conservative government attack on our trans community, as the government is intent on digging up decades-old statute called Section 35 to veto the Gender Recognition Reform Scotland Bill, remembering the strength and vitality of our people and movements has never been more important. So I'm super excited to welcome Dan to join us this evening to chat about the amazing stories that he has been collecting as part of this project. Dan, are you?
Can you hear me all right?
Hello, I can hear you, but I can't see you.
Ah, there we,
Hello.
there we go. I'm so sorry. I was late. It's a whole housing situation I'm dealing with at the moment. I'm so sorry.
Good. How are
Where
you?
now? Why is this not working? My earphones aren't working.
Can you hear me?
I can. It's very lightly. Very lightly.
Let me turn it up.
Uh,
Come a bit closer.
uh, uh, can you hear me now?
Hear you fine. Can you hear me?
No, I can hear you very lightly, but oh, shit.
Digital technology. It never goes fully smoothly, does it?
You know, have we got a lot of people in the waiting room?
No, it's just you and me. We're just having a chat with the two of us.
Oh, okay. So there's not other people in the waiting room.
It's just going to be us two having a chat about the amazing work you've done. I was speaking to Emily a little bit earlier. So she was one of the other outreach champions. And then now just a bit from you about, I guess, the research that you've been doing and the stories that you've collected.
Is this to record?
Yep. This is recorded.
Okay. Right. Okay. What's your phone number?
1 sec. Let me put it in the chat for you. And then you can give me a ring. Wait, sorry, that's the wrong one. There we go. And then you can give me a ring and you can listen that way because we can still hear you, so that's fine.
Okay, I'm gonna call you now. This works.
I'm gonna have like a little triangle.
3 8 6 6 3 4 9. Not working.
So can you hear me
Yeah.
this way?
I can. Okay, great. I didn't realize. I thought this was an like an online Zoom session.
This is
Group.
online Zoom. So we're recording live at the moment.
Oh, okay. Right. Okay. I mean, we can do here. I'm just thinking because I'm a bit late. I'm so sorry. It's a related housing issue. I can come into you. Could we postpone to another day? I could, because
Yeah,
is that okay? It's not going to be too.
that's fine. We can do another evening.
Whereabouts is the where you in?
Well, let's
where-
sign up for now because this is going live on YouTube and then we'll have a chat after. Does that sound all right?
Okay, we'll leave this now.
If you want to leave now, and I'll sign up.
Yeah.
So a little bit of a tech issue there, but all good. So we're going to sign up for this evening. We'll be back again tomorrow evening, where we'll be delving into some of the regional stories that we've collected. As part of that, we're going to be speaking to Ibrahim from the Bolton Asian Migration Project, which is a huge kind of crowdsourced project archiving the South Asian community in Bolton. After that, we'll be speaking to Chris, who is behind an incredible exhibition up in Leicester at the moment that's delving into the punk scene. and she's going to be talking about some of the amazing stories that they've collected around the Leicester punk scene, and why it's important to tell subcultural stories in smaller towns and cities. And then we'll be speaking to two of our outreach champions who are collecting stories up in Carlisle. And we'll be getting down on another evening to have a chat as well. So have a lovely evening, and thank you for